Hello, and welcome to the 5th episode of Trek Prime. Actually made it halfway to 10 here, and this is actually a subject matter that Jeff and I have been talking about for a couple of weeks now, since we did, I think, our second and third episode, and it has to do with this race, the Klingon Empire. People, when they think of Star Trek, they think of Klingons, as being the alien that they know best. There's even jokes about it. But, we're going to be talking about the Klingons in a very particular frame of reference, and that reference is going to be the relationship with the United Federation of Planets, which seems, as Jeff was explaining, as the nucleus of this blog, to be kind of counterintuitive. And I'll have Jeff take over from here to explain exactly how that is.
Yeah, my question I was going to explore for this week was that could there ever have been a possibility that the Klingons and the humans could have had a long-term treaty that would have guaranteed peace, at any point? And because where we left the Prime timeline, it was, in my opinion, it was still up in the air. I mean, because there was a lot of instability, in the Federation and in the Alpha Quadrant. So I don't know. What I did is I went back to the beginning where we were on Enterprise when they were showing the Klingons' first interaction with humans, and then when you go into the fourth season, you see where Captain Archer was on trial on the Klingon homeworld, and he was speaking with his attorney, the Klingon attorney, and the attorney was saying, I can't remember his name now, but he was saying that, he noticed that. That the younger Klingons were becoming more warlike and, more glory bound and stuff, and he didn't like the way things were turning with the future generations. So then we fast forward to Deep Space Nine, and you hear Ezri Dax talk to Lieutenant Commander Worf and telling him that, the Klingon Empire is corrupt, and she thought it should die. And, so we figure that in between, that point, and then how it progressed, how the Klingon Empire progressed up to Deep Space Nine, you have to wonder, any of those treaties that the Federation and the Klingons signed in the middle era of that time period was doomed to fail because the Klingon Empire was going through this aggressive stage in their society where the warrior class was trying to run the show pretty much, and they just wanted to conquer because that's what their society is made up of, conquered worlds and, enslavement of populations to take their resources. So, they're so diametrically opposed to the Federation and how they do things because they go out, the Klingons go out and they conquer worlds, and the Federation goes out and explores worlds, and, they make, treaties with these worlds, and they kind of interact with each other and do things and stuff like that, where the Klingons, they just force societies to work for them and take what they want. So I'll pass that to you, Andre, and you can go from there.
Well, one thing that I was mentioning in a unfortunately cut off earlier take of this particular podcast was that the Federation, if we've watched Star Trek, has on at least 2 occasions I can think of, including with the Klingons, developed allegiances and even treaties with races with philosophies very diametrically opposed to that of the Federation. One example I thought of was the Cardassians. Now, the Cardassians and the Federation were at war sometime in the early 24th century, and there was a peace treaty signed. Now, true, the Cardassians aren't as obsessed with honor and are somewhat more conspiratorial than the Klingons, who have a direct bluntness in their approach. But still, we've seen the Cardassians, in Deep Space Nine, be extremely treacherous. We've also seen in The Next Generation that they had occupied the planet Bajor for 50 to 70 years, and this was happening during the Federation war with Cardassia. Yet the Federation still signed an allegiance with these people who they had known had subjugated the Bajorans for many decades. And so in that sense, even though the Cardassian culture is very, very different than the Klingons, the Federation has often done this in order to keep the peace, or to preserve the peace, rather than so much create a situation of peace. Almost like, well, we'll be watching you carefully. As we all know who've watched different Star Trek series over the years. In the premiere episode of Season 4 for Deep Space Nine, the Khitomar Accords were annulled temporarily because Chancellor Gowron, who headed up the Klingon Empire at that time, decided that they wanted to invade Cardassia. And the Federation were facing a war with the Dominion, a diminished Cardassia who had just lost the Obsidian Order. And Gowron, again, like these young Klingons you discussed, mentioned in Enterprise, was out for glory, like the head of many empires, like the head of the Roman Empire on Earth. It got so perverted because their emperors get so obsessed with glory and so obsessed with winning the prize that their empire fell in on itself and just kind of exploded from out the middle, and something else came along. And that's what Ezri Dax was trying to tell Worf you were talking about. She asked him who was the last chancellor of the Klingon High Council that you have ever trusted? And maybe if you can't answer that, does the Klingon Empire deserve to exist? Pretty much. And, which brings up some other points. But before I go into that a little bit, I just wanted to get your particular take on that frame of reference there.
Yeah, using the Cardassians, that's a pretty good point. And again, like you said, the Cardassians are more deceitful, like Romulans in a way,
right, exactly.
than they are Klingon. So the Klingon people, I think, by the time the 24th century rolls around, I think as they were becoming more warlike, at the same time, I think there were a lot of Klingons, as we saw in the first season of TNG, that were really offended by having a treaty at all with the Federation. That's, remember you had those renegade Klingons that were...
Yes, the ones that made the little faces with their belts.
And
Chorus and Conmel was their name, I believe.
Yeah, and then if you remember, when they were talking to the captain of that Klingon ship, in the background behind him, he had the symbol of the Federation.
Yes,
and the Klingon Empire.
You had them both. Kind of one over here, one over there. Canera, I believe, was his name. So they had the Federation on each side, and even he mentioned that I think he used the analogy of Brady and the Bone. That there's this kind of this irony. He even kind of mentioned the irony of the whole treaty in that, in reference to the two Klingon criminals.
But if you watch in the first season of TNG, there was a lot of hints that were thrown out that says that the Federation conquered the Klingon Empire. Remember Q had mentioned that when they were on that planet he made up or something, where they were fighting those Civil War looking creatures. Remember?
Yeah, the Civil War animal things.
Yeah, and then Worf had said something to Q about not drinking with thine enemy and stuff, and then Q says, "Oh, they're a rigid Klingon code," which explains how you defeat them. So and then like I said, when you saw that episode where they had the Klingon and the Federation banner behind that Klingon captain, I guess the first season they made it seem like that at some point they had a war and the Klingons lost, and and that's I don't know
that alliance.
Probably just feeling around or something like that. And they weren't.
It doesn't really hold up in the history, though, does it? When you look at it.
Yeah, because later on we see that the Klingons were still just as powerful, if not more, later on. So there was no big battle. They had a bunch of little battles that happened, but they didn't have any big war that broke out where they actually decided the fate of the galaxy until we saw yesterday's Enterprise, where they had that alternate timeline there where the Federation was at war for 20 years with the Klingons and was
really losing.
Yeah. So, like I said, it was just, the Klingons, it always seems like they have all the means and everything to fight. It's just that I think they look at the treaty, the ceasefire, as I like to call it, as an opportunity to build up and just to bide their time to later on. When they feel the time is right, they'll just strike out from the borders and go right after the Federation in some way. That the peace is only good as long as as it keeps everything easy, so they can build up stuff. But then the Dominion War came along, and they had to take all of that and put it into that war effort. So the treaty was good then at the time. They used it for the Federation to help them, until Gowron was like, "Oh, I want to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to go, the hell with the Federation," And then he's like, like you said, he was going glory crazy with it.
But invading Cardassia, that whole thing.
Yeah. So after that war was over, it left the Klingons basically, depleted. So you'll probably see a long period of that going on later on. But I would like to see if they carry on Star Trek into the future, where the Klingon society is starting to change, where the war thinking is going bye-bye, and Klingons are the other part of the society, like you mentioned in that book you was reading, about how there was the other Klingon society that's focused on education and doctors and lawyers and all these other things. That Klingon society will start to influence the Klingons as a whole, and that would make peace with the Federation a lot better.
Here's the thing that would be interesting: if the Klingon could develop into something other than an empire, they could still maintain the idea of a Klingon warrior, but under a much more rigid code of honor that wasn't about subjugating planets, where they would just be like a Klingon military. Yeah. Like, it'd be a Klingon military. They still have their bat labs and their Tog knives and all their traditional weapons, but that the leaders of the High Council wouldn't just be some aged Klingon warrior. It might actually be an ambassador, a politician. We saw when Worf's son, Alexander Rozhenko, came in from the past, he was a diplomat.
Yeah.
A peacemaker, he even said himself, but he was in full Klingon warrior garb. So, I mean, they could still have their little Klingon traditions and everything, but they could just change it around a little bit so that the warrior class on the Klingon homeworld, on Kronos, wouldn't be, like you said, the only one with all the power.
Yeah.
There would be some sharing of duties in the Klingon High Council. And that would probably be the result of an extended Federation-Klingon alliance over the century, never mind decades.
Nobody said. I mean, when they mentioned in TOS though about when they met the Organians, and they said that at one point your two societies will become friends and you'll work together. They didn't mean in 100 years that was going to happen. It may not happen in 200 years. It may not happen in 3. But at some point down the road, it will happen. As the Organians pointed out. And I'm thinking that the only way it's ever going to come to that is if Klingon society finally stabilizes to a point where the Federation can actually work with them, and they can actually sit down and stop looking at each other as, enemies or something, or former enemies, and just start to work together where the border is not going to be necessary anymore between the two governments, and they'll be able to just work together and, help each other's worlds out and stuff like that.
To do this video, I actually did some studying on the Khitomar Accords, the formal name for the Klingon Alliance, and apparently the Khitomar Accords themselves all started with the destruction of Praxis. This Klingon moon that was their key energy production facility. We know from Star Trek VI, they tried to forge an alliance there, but a lot of Klingons weren't ready, and people in the Federation, so they all conspired together. But the point is that from the next year up to the Battle of Narendra 3, which we know took place in 2344, in that 40, 50-year time frame, there were negotiations between the Federation and the Klingons on much more drastic levels. There were negotiations with the Klingon Empire during Star Trek IV. The Klingon Camarag, who called Kirk a renegade and a terrorist in Star Trek IV, said that sometime between Star Trek II and III, the Federation was negotiating a peace treaty with the Klingons. And so we know there's been attempts, but after Narendra 3, we had Curzon Dax, a character we knew about from Deep Space Nine who had been involved with Klingon Federation negotiations, and an alien ambassador named Riva, who actually created a Klingon word for peacemaker. So this Riva, if he changed the Klingon vocabulary to accommodate peacemaker, perhaps some of that change within the Klingons happened during the early to mid-24th century, but that doesn't mean every Klingon would want to go with that, no more than General Chang in Star Trek VI did. Some of them might like the idea of the, supremacy of the warrior class. And they knew that an alliance with the Federation would force a change within popular Klingon thinking, and they didn't want to see that change.
Yeah.
Chorus, who was involved in that episode you mentioned, Heart of Glory from the first season of The Next Generation, he was willing to destroy the Enterprise because he did not want the traders of Kling, apparently a Klingon township or province, not the home world, to destroy Klingons. So perhaps the whole idea was that different sections, if Kling was a province or a city, perhaps different sections of the Klingon Empire were divided during that time. Some wanted peace, some didn't. We saw that in Star Trek VI. So we know the alliance wasn't secure. Like you said, it was a messy thing, and there's a good, after the Dominion War, there's a good possibility that especially after the destruction of Romulus, which is Prime, that is Prime, yeah, it's sad, but it's Prime, that would mean that the best option that could possibly come from that might be a stronger, bigger Klingon Federation alliance, forcing the Klingons to change some of their ways, perhaps leading 50 years, 100 years from then, opening up the Klingon High Council to members and even chancellors who are not, again, from the Imperial Klingon system. I mean, I don't think it'll end the Klingon Empire, but it'll
or at the same time, when all good things, the possibility could come out that the Klingons would take the opportunity to finally strike against the Romulans and wipe them out, and the Federation would sever their ties to the Klingons and defend the Romulans, what's left of them anyway. I mean, the alternate timeline thing, that went on.
If you're going with current TV's obsession with dystopia, you'll go that way. But in Star Trek Prime, it wasn't a dystopia, so I like to look at it on the more positive angle. The Klingon society will have the challenge of changing, and there'll be discomfort. There'll be Heart of Glory type moments. There'll be people like Galron. It won't be just we're all sweet, lovely Klingons now. I mean, it just mean that we'll see diversity. That's a good key. That will be diversity among the Klingons, and that it won't be just some old faded warrior up there giving orders to his subjects. That the Klingon Empire will become something more than just a series of slogans, and as you pointed out in Deep Space Nine, if the Federation confronts us with phasers, let's take out our blades.
Yeah.
You mentioned that.
They need to go back and, like you said, they explored the Ferengi pretty well. They need to explore the Klingons. We can stop generalizing these two races, because it's like the root of all prejudices is coming from generalization. And so, Star Trek, we need to really look at the Klingon society so that way we can see that, wait, there is hope. Not all the Klingons are just wanting to fight. There are some Klingons that are resisting that. There might be a small group of Klingons they're forming a counter or an insurgency against the military aspect of the Klingon Empire. They want them to stop controlling everything, and so that way it can go back to the way it was before that episode on Enterprise.
Right.
200 years before Archer and all that Klingons were a different species. But the Vulcans, they said the Vulcans just avoid them whenever they could. So that means that goes to show you that things had been changing at that time, and Klingons weren't really, not all the Klingons are really good, game for that, to be conquerors of the galaxy, So.
Well, interestingly enough, going back to the first episode of Enterprise, if you look at the specific Klingon that landed on Earth in that episode, I'm trying to think of his name. Do you remember the name of that first Klingon?
No, the actor was a wrestler there at one time.
In Enterprise, it was in the pilot episode, Broken Bow.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of his name.
I can't remember his name, but I know who he is. I can picture him.
Yeah. Well, if you remember who that was in that episode, he didn't really exactly look like what you'd think of a Klingon warrior looking like. He wasn't dressed in all that armor. And I'm wondering, and we saw that Klingon woman who knew Kempek, what was her name? Celeste? Celeste. Picard was talking to her. Yep. She was not dressed in warrior garb either. So Klingons, I don't think they're all Imperial Klingons. I think there are Klingons who, like you said, who are engineers. I think there are. I don't think necessarily that all Klingons just say, okay.
They it may have been that they didn't want to use those the uniforms that we're familiar with. They were probably trying to dress it down a little bit, because I remember when who was that, Duras, one of those Duras family members was on Enterprise, and he wasn't really wearing, the uniform that we were accustomed to. And
was it Toro?
Yeah, I can't remember, but he was Captain Duras of one of those ships that was after Enterprise. Remember when they were going into the unknown to go find the Zindi?
Oh, Enterprise. I'm sorry, I thought that was Next Generation. Okay.
Yeah.
Enterprise,
well,
yeah. In Enterprise, they had a lot more Klingons in different kind of civilian clothes too. It's weird.
Yeah, they didn't really wear it. It was sort of like like furs or something like that they were wearing or something. So I don't know. Maybe it just means they just didn't have that uniform yet, where they had all the pieces that can come off and they can assemble a phaser out of it.
They just make the gun out of a little belt, But it's funny. The Klingons, as it is, if you look at their history, they have different looks. Like in Enterprise, their outfits in TOS. Their outfits in TOS, of course, they look different, but that's a whole other story. Their whole outfits in TOS are less overtly Imperial and are more, I don't know, they're kind of like, I don't know how you describe them. They're more like a vest,
Yeah, it's like a chrome kind of vest with a sash that went across,
Right, and when you saw Worf, he had that Klingon sash.
Yeah.
Now, sometime between that and the motion picture, they had all these armor all over them, and they've always had armor. You never saw them in those vest outfits.
Yeah, they went way, way over the top, and they did the head, they did the uniforms, they changed. When I first saw it, I remember I was like, who are they? And why are they flying around in Klingon ships? I mean, who are these people? And I was thinking, maybe, because I didn't get it, and plus they weren't even speaking English. They had to translate on the bottom what they were saying, and it's like, who are these people? Or it took me a while to figure out that they were the Klingons, but it's like they didn't look like that on TOS.
Right, they totally made a whole changeover. So obviously that's this real life budget and all that, but if the Klingons, if you did that in the Star Trek universe, the Klingons obviously changed at some point at that point.
I still like the idea of there being like two types of Klingons, because that's originally what people were going with, that they were the Imperial class.
That's what they did in Bases of Fire. They wrote in those two Klingon subcultures.
I mean, because it's like, remember you were saying how you like the idea of the Zindi having all these different
right, you did too.
Classes. And that would have been nice too, because here on Earth, not everybody looks the same. I mean, you got your dark skin, your light skin, your brown skins, you got red, and it's just there's different looks to the humans, and there should be different looks to these other races. Some of the Romulans may not have to look all alike, and because I know they added a thing to the Romulans.
Right, Romulans, the head,
they put that
triangle
the extra bone, looks like a bone there that goes up in there.
Yeah, because Klingons were just originally Vulcans were just. Romulans were just basically rehashed Vulcans with pointed ears. They didn't have that little bone thing.
Yeah.
So you get
they were supposed to be just Vulcans, that left the Vulcan, and they just started their own world. So it's like, well, how come the Vulcans didn't have that after a while grow a bone? So maybe it was something about the world that they were living on that kind of altered their physiology a little bit. I don't know. But
like I said, they've tried to explain the Klingon thing. I don't know, but races like that are Imperial, Romulans are Imperial. Perhaps there was an internal genetic engineering that went on with that. I don't know. I mean, again, it's budgetary reasons for us, but we got to deal with it in the show, because Star Trek isn't a show, the Romulans have some little bone, nobody cares. Star Trek fans pick up on that because it's our future. They think of Star Trek as our future, and I repeat that, I suppose, a lot in this. And when they see our future, and they see inconsistencies, you got to wonder, it would be like, you got to wonder in the big picture, if 100, 200 years from now, if portraits of Donald Trump are going to look like the current portraits of John Smith of the Mormon Church look like today.
Yeah.
John Smith paintings do not look like what the earliest drawings of him look like. They just don't.
Yeah.
They've been doctored up to make him look more handsome, I guess. But, you got to wonder if, just with the way Star Trek works and the way it functions, if that kind of went along with that idea. And you also mentioned that, you know, the whole racism is born out of stereotypes. That could be a good way of exploring the human condition in Star Trek that they did. The idea that even Data, who's not human, did say about Worf in one episode that there's a genetic disposition toward hostility among all Klingons. Now, is Data just stating scientific information that he has, or is that just some kind of propaganda the Federation put out there that all Klingons just fight?
Well, I guess we want to assume coming from Data that you must have, you know, picked that up from Data, or that, you know, that he's, you know, just acquired, you know, from reading or something like that, you know, because anything that what Data would say is obviously going to be something of
Right, I don't think it's emotionally based. It can't be, because he has no emotions. But
if a regular person had said that, then you'd say, "Hey, wait, you sound like a bigot," you know. It's like, but when Data says it, it's not. It's just like he's very objective about everything.
Yeah, it's like an encyclopedic reaction.
Yeah.
But the thing about that is that you wonder if the information he got was just on a Federation database. Like, you know, with people now, we often say that, oh, some races are just internally bred inferior. You know, because we've seen examples of Klingons being effective scientists and effective other positions. But, you know, like I said, perhaps, you know, you could say humans have a genetic predisposition toward certain hostility. You know, I don't know. But the Klingons don't show indications of not knowing how to be something other than a warrior. I mean, anybody can hang on 180, as they say. And maybe if the Klingons survive, you know, Ezri may be right. The Klingon Empire, as it exists, may need to just fall out of favor and develop into a new, more all-inclusive High Council that has a warrior class as a militia, as a military, but that does not operate by subjugating planets, and perhaps by more Klingons attending Starfleet Academy than going through the Empire.
Yeah.
Worf was the only one because he was raised by humans. But, you know, you got to wonder in the 25th century if you'll see Federation Stardust with more Klingon nationals as Federation members, as Starfleet officers.
That's what I was kind of mentioning before. I mean, you'll probably see a point, I guess, where all this angst over the warrior class taking over society on the Klingon homeworld is going to shift at some point, because, you know, with Martok being the Emperor now instead of Gowron, there's some hope there that Martok might be a little more liberal, you know, in a way. I mean, because he seemed that way as a general during the war. He thought before he went and did stuff, you know.
But he wasn't the glory hog that Gowron was.
Yeah. So, you know, he cared more about, you know, his people and his you know, what outcomes of battles would take. So, you know, there's this hope that, you know, maybe Martok would be the first, you know, Klingon chancellor that would start the path for the whole society of starting to undo that, you know, less fighting and the stuff that goes on with the Klingon people. And
also, like, you look at our own history. You know, now true, it was a defeat, but on our on the other party's part. But look at the difference between Japan of today and Imperial Japan 60, 70 years ago. You know, I mean, you know, there's been significant changes. So the Japanese culture, Japanese youth culture, bears precious little resemblance to what it did 70, 80 years ago. You know, so the Klingon Empire, it may not take that long. I mean, the Japanese Empire was quite old. The Klingon Empire is quite old. You know, the change can happen. You know, and even though we're talking about,
you know, I'm glad you brought that up, because the Japanese people have every reason in the world to hate our guts as Americans after what we did over there. Those two,
right? The A-bombs. Yeah.
But their whole society had turned around since then, and we work with them. You know, we invite them over here. They like us, and they, you know, we talk to these people on the internet, and you know, we have these relations now. And
they're both using mostly Japanese technology, talking to each other right now.
I mean, so we got this really close connection with Japan.
Exactly.
If they didn't change who they were, like you said, you know, we probably would still be fighting with them today. But because they changed, you know, and like I said, they had every reason in the world not to want to be friends with us after what we did over there.
Exactly.
They went and they did the biggest thing that any society could do, is they put that behind them, and they moved ahead, and they said work toward peace instead.
Now, imagine if the Federation, who would never advocate under normal circumstances, for anything like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Okay?
Yeah.
They wouldn't advocate for that personally unless it was like a dire situation. But the thing with them would be that if the Federation negotiated some sort of really tight peace, I have no doubt that the Klingons could change to accommodate it, and as the Organians suggested, that the Klingons and the Federation could come together in some sort of genuine peaceful situation.
Yeah.
So some sort of camaraderie.
We see that the Cardassians, after what happened to them in the Dominion War, would probably have that come to Jesus moment, like people would say, where they would say, well, we're going to stop fighting with the Federation, we're going to work with them.
Yeah, they didn't have a choice, though, did they? Their plan was pretty wrecked.
Yeah, I mean, you could still, it's like what happened with Japan. I mean, they were
right, exactly. At the end of the Dominion War, the Vorta were just blowing up random Cardassian cities until they did what they wanted them to do.
So, yeah, I mean, you could have that big change in their society, mirroring what happened with Japan, where now they become their greatest allies and friends and stuff like that, and actually embrace the Bajorans, and the Bajorans reciprocate, and you see this great big union that happens between the two. I mean, that would be something to carry on, like you said, into the 25th century or the later episodes. Right.
And then they could meet up with new challenges. They had new challenges to face, but the old ones would finally get resolved. Maybe the 24th century was about kind of coming to some resolutions about some of the issues in the 23rd. Now, I don't know if the Cardassians were known by the Federation during the 23rd. I don't really know. The Klingons sure were. And they had a very different relationship. At the end of that century, the kind of early stirrings of the Alliance started to happen. But yeah, I don't think as you started out, I don't know if looking at it in this way, if the alliance between the Federation and the Klingons, the first one, the Khitomar Accords, was all that steady. It was more like a step. And it was an alliance.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, okay, we're going to have Klingons be Federation members.
Yeah.
They were allies. And that's a tenuous thing.
Yeah.
The Cardassians, there was a treaty. So I don't know if that was a higher level thing than with the Klingons. I really don't know.
I think with the Cardassians is when they made their treaty, there was both sides had to give up something, and that's what started the Maquis problem. Right,
when they were trying to do the border skirmish.
And everybody in Starfleet didn't like the way the treaty was played out because it gave too much. They figured it gave too much to the Cardassians, and so with the Klingons and the Khitomar thing, I think what happened was whatever it was probably more of a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities, so that way they could help the Klingons deal with the results of what happened with Praxis, to probably help them find a new homeworld or something like that where they can resettle on. Maybe that was part of the treaty, was that they could help them or something, that might have been for a while. I mean, and then after that, like I said, it probably led up to where we go into where the Enterprise C was, where, the Romulans attacked the Klingon outposts, and, the Enterprise C comes to rescue, and they have that thing where it either went one way or the other, one timeline or the other timeline. So I think that's what was going on up to that point, is that, there was a ceasefire and they were kind of helping each other to, the Federation was helping the Klingons to resettle to a new world. So
I'm going to go really far off the field here, but I'm just going to make this brief because it's really far afield. But some of these things you mentioned with the Klingon Empire and the issues that had happened historically probably could have been addressed during the 1990s on Deep Space Nine or in other movies or whatever, if they hadn't spent so much energy in the Star Trek staff writing in the Kazon for Voyager. And I mentioned the Kazon because at the time, everybody basically described them as discount Klingons.
Yeah.
Now, when I say that, the Kazon, to me, they were more like maybe Klingons in a very primitive, tribal, almost superstitious kind of sense.
It's probably like the way the Klingons were, like way, way in the past, or something. Maybe at some time.
Almost like, because when you look at the Klingons, they have a strict house system, almost a caste system. And, there are strict honor things, honor guards, whatever. Where the Kazon were like, if you have something, I'll give it to you. If you don't, you die. Basically, it was very very raggedy. But like I said, they put a lot of energy into this really unorganized society, and I think the Klingons, as you pointed out, became caricatures of what there was supposed to be in Star Trek. And I think Worf who said perhaps today is not a good day to die.
Yeah.
And I think Esri had also mentioned that with him. The Klingons are always thinking about a good way to die here, a good way to die there, but they're not talking a lot about living.
Yeah.
I mean, where does even the Klingon warriors say it's a good day to live to the next glorious battle we'll fight?
Yeah.
They're always thinking about dying, and if you think about dying, you're probably going to die. If you keep living enough, you're going to invite death. So if you think that, well, I could die, but I'll live to the next battle, then you're on somewhat of the right track.
Yeah.
Because you're not thinking in terms of, it's almost like suicide bombers in a way. The whole glory will die for our empire.
Yeah.
But not the idea we'll live to another glorious battle. So perhaps the idea of the Klingons is developing the idea of looking at life as being important to that race, that they can become closer to what the Federation's trying to do.
That would be where the change would come in the future, beyond where we left off in the Prime timeline. I think that's where the change would start. Is they would
have being martyrs, being less about that.
They'd have to put aside that mentality of dying for everything all the time and start thinking about living for a society to better itself instead of just fighting and depleting all their resources and doing that.
Because obviously the Klingons are not like Earth. They have an economic system. And Spock mentioned the Klingons have an enormous military budget, which makes sense because, they're an empire. And basically, I don't know, perhaps there are common Klingon citizens who live like paupers because they're delivering extra duranium and extra stem bolts and field coils to these war efforts.
Well, see, that's an area right there that I think they could have explored. Because
right.
I think
briefly
went over that, where they said that, these ships belong to this house, and these ships belong to this house. And remember when they was having that civil war there in TNG, and they had to, and Gowron was trying to get factions, families, houses together to fight with him. They had more. Now, so I'm thinking, they got a military, but is it a military like what we think of a military is, or is it just a bunch of houses, bunch of clans, basically, who have their own ships coming together to serve the Klingon government? Is it more like that? It's a military.
That's a good point because I think it was Gene Roddenberry or somebody in the staff once compared the Klingon Empire set up to being more like Vikings, where you had clans that were loyal to a crest, and each family would have their own boat or ship or whatever they had, or they would fight their own battles. Maybe that's how the Klingon works. It's not like an organized army where everybody can join, but they go through a Klingon training system where they train from young age to be a warrior, and they go out and fight on their family's ships or their family's small fleet of ships.
Yeah.
Maybe each one.
The Duras were supposed to be a rich family, from what we gather, because of the sisters and
Duras himself.
Yeah, so they were a power to reckon with because they were trying to take over the chancellorship, I guess. For a long time.
As you pointed out, way back in Enterprise, there was a Chancellor Duras then.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a dynasty. There's like a Duras dynasty.
Yeah.
So they are apparently very important families. Perhaps, you got to wonder if the families like the Duras, kind of staying in there, being like the equivalent, the equivalent on that planet of the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, even political families like the Kennedys or the Bushes. Yeah. We're in a democratic society. We don't obviously have dynasties, but those could be, or in other countries, like even North Korea, for example, have the Kim dynasty.
Yeah.
Or Windsor, they have the dynasty there. So it could be the Klingons have a dynasty system where like you have Duras, and then because they already have sins of the father. The Klingons dishonored, and all that.
We know that Martok his family wasn't very wealthy. They came, he said, from the lowlands or something like that, and Kor rejected him Remember, because he was
From the
Khitomar
Academy, yeah.
Was from a higher family clan
Right.
than.
So it probably is a caste dynasty, you know.
Yeah. So
'Cause we-
it seems to me like it's these dynasties probably that are controlling all these wars that they're fighting all the time.
Exactly.
And the ones under them, the less of them, we'll just call them the middle class.
Right.
They're that have to go along with it because they don't have the power to stop it.
Maybe that's why. Maybe that's why.
It's like, yeah, power to them is military power, so they don't have the ability to actually fight the dynasties, so they have to go along with it.
Maybe that's why Gowron was so glory hungry, because Worf described him in the episode Reunion, the first one he appeared in, as an outsider who challenged the council. So maybe Gowron, maybe his family was not that well known. He might have been from a caste outside of that, outside of the council, because we never knew any of Gowron's family member per se. You know, so I think the whole idea with Gowron is maybe he had to puff his chest out because he only had himself to deal with.
Yeah.
And if you look at him, there were a lot of blunders and a lot of bad choices he made. Where now Martok didn't come from a prominent family, but he had one. So maybe he understood the ideas of honor in a different level. That it's not just about glory. That there's, like he said, we have to be tacticians and look at the situation on a broader level.
Yeah.
Rather than just let's go out and die in glorious battle or whatever. That we have to figure out if this battle is glorious enough for us to take, or if it will deplete our resources in the Empire.
And another part of the Klingon society that we really don't see much of is the females.
Right. They're kind of just a sideshow on.
Yeah, they're just in the background practically. We don't really know that much about Klingon females.
Except for the Duras sisters, who are basically just...
They're just men in skirts, basically, because they're just doing what,
Right. But I
the realistic, deceitful Duras family members, but we don't really get to see an actual Klingon woman as she is on their world. What does she do?
Well, we do know that there are actually female Klingon warriors, but they're just Klingon warriors, like you said. But we saw when I think her name was Vixis in Star Trek 5. Sorry. I think we never really saw the idea of a Klingon mother, for example. We saw Khitomar, but she was half human. We never saw a full Klingon mother, how a Klingon mother would raise the child. I don't know if the males do. I don't know if Klingons have any perception of, I don't know, what we call a housewife. I don't know if it works that way, if there's...
Well, it's like you said, we know that we've seen Klingon women on some of the ships.
Right, as warriors, right.
And we know that there, in TOS we saw one Klingon woman who was the wife of Kang, and she was a scientist, okay? And she seemed to be more reasonable, to deal with than the Klingon men. So I just felt like, for a long time we've been like sort of saying that, the men dominate the society to an nth degree, and the women are they're just servants to the men. But if they are, then why do they incorporate them into these combat situations? I mean, I don't get it. See, there's some confusion there with that.
Well, if you look at the Klingons, when Worf and Jadzia Dax got married, there was this whole thing about how the Klingon gods created the first Klingon, and basically an Adam and Eve story.
Yeah.
And, they created the Klingon female out of that, and then the Klingon male and female kill their gods.
Yeah.
That was how the mythology was written. So, obviously, you imagine that at one point, Klingon society was probably originally very sexist. And I imagine that over time, because of the fact they were such a militaristic culture, they gradually allowed women to become Klingon warriors. There may have been a time, I don't know if it was during Enterprise, where women were not allowed to become warriors. Or at all.
Well, they did have one female Klingon. Remember that ship they were trying to rescue, that Klingon ship, and they had that female that was kind of hiding there on the ship or something like that. Okay. So
remember, by Enterprise that happened. But you got to wonder if sometime before that, maybe even in our time in the 21st century or before, if Klingons, men and women, weren't necessarily that equal. If women were allowed to become warriors or anything.
Maybe this is what's going on. Maybe the Klingon women aren't as glory-minded as the Klingon males are. Maybe
they're more
just
pragmatic.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, they're the more reasonable of the sides of the species. They'll serve in the military, but they're not so quick to go into a situation where they could die. But because you don't actually see any, I don't remember any episode where there was actually a Klingon female as a captain on a ship. It was just always men. So I don't know how far they're even allowed to progress in the military. If like you said, if it's a sexist society, if they even allow that. I mean, I don't know.
And we saw Martok's, wife. Remember, she was trying to instruct Jadzia in traditional Klingon wedding. She was more like kind of a Devil Wears Prada character. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Kind of this really haughty fashionista, but very much in control. She wasn't one of these people who are like, oh, if you don't get this right, I will slice your head off with my bat left. She was more like, I'll just insult you until you do it right. But again, more like this queen in charge of the situation.
You ever watch Saturday morning cartoons when he's growing up, like the Bugs Bunny and all that?
Oh yeah.
Remember the
Tunes,
gorilla, the female gorilla, and the female gorilla's walking around with a rolling pin, and the minute he screws up, she whacks him over the head with the rolling pin.
That sounds like that, doesn't it? But like I said, what was
that? She whacks him over the head with a rolling pin.
That Klingon, Sorella was her name, the wife of Mantak. Sorella. Yeah, and because I remember her because she and Dax were sparring like in this Devil Wears Prada moment.
Yeah,
and it's like she was the most prominent Klingon woman I think we've ever seen, and I think she was a warrior.
Yeah,
I want, and again, her whole thing was about maintaining tradition, about like being a trainer, like almost like a teacher type, like a really strict teacher. So I'm wondering if Klingon women, if they have this genetic predisposition toward hostility, if they channel it more toward being, guides and teachers and being strict.
Yeah, their image.
Master type figures. Rather than, or status, rather than, I'm going to go slice somebody and kill them or whatever. That they channel it differently.
Yeah, I see where you're going. Yeah, it could be that. It's.
But we saw it with Sorella for sure.
It would explain why you don't see that many women in combat with the Klingons, but when it comes to the females, they might be more, like you said, into acquiring status as a way of gaining honor. Because remember when Dax was going through her history and she found out that that some stuff she embellished in there, and she got mad when she cornered her. So I mean, obviously, it was very important for her that she came from Imperial blood, even though it was.
It was almost like she was one of those daughters of the Confederacy who was like, well, my blood is this much and this much and this much, and how dare you say it isn't? That sort of thing. Like it was almost like an episode of Dynasty or something where, oh, you're of this line and all this kind of business. So maybe the Klingon women are into, because there was an episode which, speaking of racism, is said to be really racist. That I'm kind of in and out on it, where they go to this planet where this leader kidnaps Tasha Yar, wants to marry her.
Oh yeah, okay.
It's kind of like an African-Chinese culture combination. And they said on that planet it was the duty of women to own land and the men to protect it. And what I'm wondering if on the Klingon Empire, if it isn't kind of similar, if the women own the land or property and men protect it.
It could be. It could be because the houses are very important. Remember when Quark had to deal with what's her name?
Klingon woman, Grilka.
Yeah, Grilka. And she was real fighting like hell to keep
Quark. Yeah.
The house. they were there.
They called it the House of Quark in the episode.
Yeah. But she had to fight like hell to keep her house because it was society wouldn't let a woman have control of that. Because she didn't have a husband, I think is what it was going on. And if I remember right, that was the reason why she needed to find out if that her husband had died in a certain way or something. That way she would get control.
It works like this. Maybe women on the Klingon Empire do own the actual land, but the men or their husbands or whatever are in charge of the individual houses they're part of. Because I don't know if the Klingons are divided. I don't know if the houses, like they're obviously not like real houses. They don't have like have a house with a little label on it saying House of Moog or anything. You know, I don't think it's works that way. A little shack with a House of Moog written on it. I think that what it would be like the houses represent families, like clans, like you said. And I don't think she would have any say over that. But I think Rilke might actually fiscally own land for these people. And again, the men protect it, which means it's essentially their land. But she just happens to own it. So if she doesn't have a husband, then all she has is this useless land because, you know, there's no house to protect anymore. Because she's gone. And I guess when the husband's gone, she's not necessarily a member of that house anymore.
Yeah.
So I mean, Klingon system has, I think it has hierarchical structures for sure. And you know, getting back to the Federation Alliance, I'm wondering if a deeper analyzation and perhaps restructuring of that hierarchical system in the future might not strengthen the Federation Klingon Alliance, because, as you know, the Federation were the Bajorans. Remember that Bajoran came out of the wormhole and wanted to introduce the caste system back to Bajor?
Yeah.
Captain Sisko did say specifically caste-based discrimination was against the Federation Charter. So I'm sure they had to work out some caste-based issues among the Klingons the same way, because they have the houses, and that's definitely caste. So, and they're a higher caste like the Doros. And Picard said many times they had to kind of edge out of Klingon affairs a little bit because they were getting kind of messy. So I imagine that these would all be variables that have to work out. The idea of the subjugation of planets, mild subjugation of women, I imagine, you know, and simply the fact of the hierarchical imperial system, like with Japan, would have to be, you know, and I don't think it would have to be as intense like you imply about the first season of TNG, where the Federation occupied the Klingon homeworld, or in All Good Things the same way. I don't think it has to be like that. I think there can be another way to do it, but there'd have to be some changes more on the Klingon side than anything.
Yeah, that's what I was coming to. The conclusion would have to be the Federation is already doing the right thing, but the Klingons are always the ones that are always having the trouble. They're always getting into
right, exactly, because they have that old warrior code that's not quite going away, and
government constantly unstable and rocky all the time. So you can't really make a treaty with the government like that, because you don't know if tomorrow if that treaty is going to be worth the paper it's printed on. Because
Kalar said once that Klingon civil wars seldom stay confined to the Empire, which would mean that there's so much instability among the Klingons. Then what's going to happen is the war is going to spread out and involve other races.
Yeah.
So you got to wonder if all these wars in the 23rd century and 24th all started with some internal squabbling among the Klingon houses.
Yeah, so look how Gowon tried to drag Picard and the Federation into that civil war right off the bat.
He pretty much dragged him right into it, basically.
Yeah, he was abusing the Khitomar Accords and saying, "Look, come help us out," you know, and everything. And Picard's like, "No, we got rules we got to follow. We can't interfere with another society here. You know, we can't do that." And so he takes that as a personal insult, even though the spirit of the treaty that they had stipulated certain things, you know, when he's trying to abuse it, you know. So, I mean, it's like you said, there's constantly, you know, infighting going on in their government, and, you know, it's hard to have a relationship with the government where tomorrow you got a different chancellor. You go to bed one night and it's the next day it's somebody else because the other one got assassinated. You know what I'm saying?
Right. It's almost like, you know, in that situation where there's all these assassinations, there's all this corruption among the Klingon High Council, you got to wonder how they were able to maintain the alliance for 20, 25 years before the Dominion. It's so rocky.
Yeah.
I mean,
Impact was it? He said he was the longest chancellor in the Klingon Empire, I guess. So you could figure he was probably the chancellor from the time of the Khitomar Accords all the way up to where you got.
You mean Kimpek?
Was it Kimpek? Was that his name?
The one who got assassinated?
Yeah, remember he was
poisoned. That was Kimpek.
Yeah. So he was probably the chancellor for all those years after Star Trek VI.
Because he was an older man in that, so.
Yeah, he was really old. So, yeah. And then after that, things started to go crazy with Gowron and Duras and and the Dominion War and all that other stuff. I mean,
So, I mean, at first, when I was thinking about your subject matter, I thought, well, there could be some frames of references here. But now that I look at it with all these variables, the alliance is tenuous and complex at the very best.
yeah.
And there's always a balance because it's not just the Klingon system, it's what's happening in the High Council itself, as Redax pointed out. There's so much corruption. The Doros were a big problem. And I think now that the Doros are gone and not powerful anymore, I mean, if you saw what happened with the Sword of Kahless, Toral was just like a neophyte. He was answering for the House of Doros, but they really had no more power. I think with that not being an issue anymore, and with, like you said, Gowron being gone, and with Kempek being the head of the High Council now, you might see the beginnings of some more significant change in the Empire.
Yeah. I think that happened. And after all this, what we talked about, I can say that we know more about the Klingons than we ever did about the Romulans, because I can't think of anything about the Romulans that would, except for that.
Romulans are almost like, they're almost I mean, there are races that appeared for one episode. We know more about them than the Romulans, in a way. Yeah.
I mean, even when we had that episode where reunification with Leonard Nimoy in it, and they were showing the underground movement of the Romulans, the young Romulans, trying to change the way things are. That's basically all we know is, they have ground.
It's funny, a lot of people, I just want to get on the side of it, a lot of people I notice are not always that fond of unification. Some think it was just like a foil to showcase Spock. That, I don't know.
I thought there was something there, a story there, because like I said, before that, we didn't really know.
Yeah, they didn't, the thing with unification that may upset some people is that they had an opportunity to tell a really important story, and it just got to be another story of Romulan treachery in the end. They really could have had an opportunity to focus on this reunification movement.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it was the outcome that people didn't
like. It's like, you just had Sela and this conspiracy with Pardak and all that stuff. And by the way, Senator Pardak was also, from what I was reading, he was kind of, he was kind of present with Curzon Dax with some of the Klingon Federation Accords too, probably before Narendra 3. But, who knows? I mean, Pardak, we know he betrayed his people. Perhaps he was involved in the attack on the Klingon outpost of Narendra 3, for all we know. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, because like I said, Romulans seem to employ a lot of double agent kind of people in their culture, where Klingons, their whole thing is that a person who kills without showing their face is no Klingon. So the Klingons are like, you're going to see who's going to take you over and kill you. They're not into, we're going to make believe that we're all good or whatever,
Yeah.
That's another difference between Cardassians, too. They try to pretend they're something they're not.
Yeah. But, I mean, as far as the Romulans go, I can understand how that story ended. It was kind of disappointing because it just, like you said, it just goes back to the old stereotype of the Romulans playing their silly games again.
Right, the chess game thing, yeah.
But the thing is, we did learn a little bit that not every Romulan on Romulus is all, happy with the way things are run on their planet, and they'd like to see something better. And Spock decides he wants to stay there, and we never find out how far he ever got because, like you said, the planet's gone now. So, I mean, and so that's a story lost right there.
If that Romulus being destroyed is actually truly Prime timeline.
Yeah.
That might be Discovery Prime timeline. I don't know.
If they brought Leonard Nimoy into it, we have to assume that would happen on timeline.
Well, we're not talking about that, though. We're not talking about that. We're talking about Trek Prime here, but it has to come up, I guess, sometimes, because now I hear them calling it the Star Trek multiverse.
Yeah.
But in Trek Prime, in the Trek universe, in this one universe we have, the one that shrunk down in that warp bubble and destroyed the Enterprise when Crusher tried to escape. Yeah. Assuming that's the same universe in her mind. That's her little version of the universe. It's big enough to swallow the Enterprise, whatever. But just that whole thing, I think that in that universe, if we look in the future of that universe, I think the Klingons are going to have to make some changes, if nothing for themselves. They're just going to have to. So is there anything else you wanted to cover with this issue?
No, that's pretty much it.
Well, I think we actually came to some interesting conclusions. And, you know, maybe a cliche to say this, but with the Klingon Federation Alliance and how it's going to grow and where it came from, would you say that in the end the questions may be more important than the answers?
Well, I think the answers would be surprising, you know, especially, you know, coming from the Klingon side. Because, like you said, we've got to overcome our generalizations of these characters in order to see them advance. So if they change, it's going to be like, wow, the Klingons are different now.
So anyway, well, yeah. So thank you for talking about this, and it would turn out to be a great subject, more than I could ever have thought of. And we'll see you next time on Trek Prime. So long and prosper, everybody.